Hello, everybody. If you've just dialed in already, we are here at the Wine Communicators of Australia webinar series. We'll be starting in about 20 seconds. We're just giving everyone a chance to log in. So we're seeing the numbers kind of jump up now. So just hold on a few seconds and we'll start shortly. Watching those numbers tick in. It's always fun logging into Zoom calls or any other online video conferencing. Okay, numbers seem to have stabilised, so we will start now. Good afternoon and welcome everybody. I'm Ruth Harris. I'm the Executive Officer here at Wine Communicators. Thanks for joining us for this month's webinar on trending varieties and styles. Today we're joined by Lee Firkin from Endeavour Group and Sam Scarrett from Vine Health. And we're looking at trending varieties and styles in the off-premise and also a little bit of a window into how this is reflected in vineyard plantings. So Sam and I are coming to you from the land of the Kaurna people in South Australia, and Lee is on Wurundjeri land in New South Wales. We also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today and pay our respects to elders past, present and future. This presentation will take about 40 minutes, leaving us time at the end for questions. So I don't know if you're very familiar with Zoom, but if you look down the bottom of your screen and you hover over the bar at the bottom, you should have a Q&A section and a chat section. So what we ask is only use the chat section if you're having technical issues, like you can't hear us or something like that. Use the Q&A button to ask all your questions, and then we'll be looking at those when it's question time. So if you can't see the Q&A section, click the three dots and activate your Q&A section. So as usual, we are recording this webinar and a link to the recording will be sent to you afterwards. But now let me introduce our first speaker, Lee Firkin. Lee's the head of commercial wine for Endeavour Group. And Endeavour are gold partners of Wine Communicators, and their support has really helped us deliver all of our programs, including this webinar. So Lee brings over 25 years of experience in category management in liquor retail for BWS, Liquorland, Dan Murphy. So there's probably no one better qualified in Australia to talk about what's happening in the off-trade. WCA invited Lee to present this data that comes from the State of the Grapes data report that Endeavour released 2 weeks ago. The report reflects Endeavour's ongoing commitment to share their extensive knowledge and insights for the betterment of the whole industry. This report opens up an array of insights into Australian wine consumption patterns drawn directly from the shopping data of Dan Murphy's and BWS customers, and it's showing us what Australian customers are really buying. So it's now my pleasure to hand over to you, Lee.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. We want this one. Okay, I'm just checking with everybody that that's come up. All right. So, sorry, not a usual Zoom user. And so we will just kick in. I'm just going to give everybody today just an overview of what's happening in the Australian wine market. We'll do that at a national level, and then we'll work through to each of the states, and I'll give you a flyover of what the sort of nuances and similarities that we are seeing exist across all of the major wine consuming states in Australia. So the key themes for today touch on the fact that affluence and generation are very significant drivers to consumer choices of wine, that we have established that over 50% of the sales of wine in Australia come from New South Wales and Queensland, which would be no surprise given the population, but there is a significant underindex in Australian wine in those two states. That there is a shift towards consumption of wine in more sociable occasions, and that the big three varietals and their performance is happening at a national level. So I'm just going to come to the national view. Okay, so at the highest level, all the factors that we use to understand the wine consumer are on this little whistle stop slide, which I really like. And for those of you who haven't seen the distilled article and the state of the grapes, what I'll just call out is the color coding that exists, not just on this slide, but throughout the whole presentation. So the darker, let's call it peachy color, talks to a significant under-index, and then the darker green talks to a significant over-index. And if it's blue, it's kind of in the middle, neutral, in line with everywhere else. So if we work around the slide, what you can see is that affluence illustrates an over-indexation to wine. Our older consumers, and particularly baby boomers and traditionalists, over-index in wine. Metropolitan stores over-index in wine. Store formats that are associated with supermarkets over-index in wine. And we also see Dan Murphy's as a standalone retail banner, so a large format store, over-index in wine compared to sort of a more convenience-orientated retail environment. And that's not true of just wine, but of all alcohol as well. So we'll just, and probably the only thing, other thing I'd call out on this slide is you can clearly see that the suburbs that are more affluent have material over-index in wine. And, you know, if you think about Mossman, Wallara, Willoughby, Lane Cove in New South Wales in particular, very, very affluent suburbs, very strong over-indexation in the wine category. So what the sort of research that we've undertaken to produce this report clearly unpacked was that we at Endeavour think that affluence is the most important factor, and that's in terms of customers' propensity to buy wine, but also in terms of the wines that they actually buy. And the affluence transcends the state boundaries. So what our customers are buying, and there's no real surprises here, our premium customers in the wine category are buying champagne and red wine. And that's because red wine obviously has a significant price ladder. Our mainstream customers have an over-indexation in rosé and sparkling, and the more budget-orientated customers over-index in white wine, cask and fortified. Affluence will also impact other segment choices. So you can see here that, and again, this kind of gets down to the next level of detail into varietals, where you can see varieties like premium Pinot over-index with premium customers, whereas things like Moscato, Sauvignon Blanc over-index more with our value customers, and then things like Chardonnay are a bit more neutral and in the middle. So the takeaway here is very much that wine significantly over-indexes in high LGA areas across the country, and we're focusing adequately on the categories offerings for those customers. There's an opportunity in our under-indexes of mainstream and budget customers who are choosing liquor categories to make sure that we put the right varieties in front of them, and hopefully within those varieties offer them options that can, over time, potentially trade them up the ladder a little bit. Generation's also really important in terms of how customers interact with the wine category, and this won't be a surprise to anybody, but the younger cohort of customers, which in Endeavour we talk to as our legal drinking age and younger millennials, prefer wines that are sweeter, effervescent, and can also be used as giftable products. Our millennials have an over-indexation for Pinot and Grenache. Riesling's a really interesting varietal because at the moment it's got an over-indexation in young cohorts of customers, but also those more traditional customers in the boomer group. And then in the middle generations, it's things like Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Grigio that are really over-indexing their proportionality of varietals consumed. This is my, I think, most favourite slide that we have released as part of the information that we've put out into market. And it really starkly shows the transition that we've got going on in terms of the varietals that customers are drinking. You can see that our Gen Z and younger millennial customers are moving out of red, and they are heavily moving into things like rosé, white and sparkling. And there is a version of this chart that exists just for Generation Z. So let's call that 25 to 18-year-olds. And it is even more pronounced. It is literally a third, a third, a third into red, white and sparkling. So if you kind of fast forward what that means for all of the people growing wine and producing wine and growing grapes, there's a transition that is going to happen over the course of the next decade or so as these customers increase their wine consumption off a very different spread of varietals. The other thing that is changing quite quickly is the prevalence of the female consumer in wine. And we have seen, even in the last sort of year or 2 years, a big shift into more women drinking wine, to the point that now 2/3 of wine is actually consumed by females. And the occasions that we're losing, which you can see on this chart, are the occasions that would have been quite universally spread between men and women. So sitting down at a dinner table where there might be at home a husband and a wife scenario, and they're the types of occasions that are leaking the most out of the wine consumer. Where we are seeing them transition to are smaller social gatherings over the weekend. So what that means from a varietal spread is that solo over food, which is being dominated by what we sort of largely bundle up together as the traditional mature varietals, are being dropped from the repertoire. And at the social occasions, we're seeing more spritz, we're seeing more rosé, we're seeing sparkling, we're seeing Prosecco being consumed. So big shift, not only in who is consuming, but the type of occasion they're consuming, and then what varietals that they're trying at those different occasions. Okay, we'll now move into some things that are happening within the category that are driving some growth, which is always nice to see. So our share of wine has definitely stabilized over the last couple of years. Coming out of COVID, we had seen a bit of a leakage into the other categories, but pleasingly over the last 12 to 24 months, that decline out of wine at a total value level has dissipated. And actually last year we actually grew a smidge of wine share, which we're very proud of within the Endeavour team. But what we are seeing is spritz, Bagnums, Pinot Gris, Prosecco, some single serve product and Riesling all help support growth in the category. So we need to stay ahead of the trends, and that means conversely that we will continue to shape our range to suit what customers are wanting to buy from us. So we will be continuing to think about rationalising some of the more traditional varietals to give more opportunity to the varietals that customers are consuming and choosing to purchase. So we'll move across into the states. And as I alluded to earlier, affluence is definitely the dominant driver of wine purchasing and consumption. But what you can see play out here in this particular chart is that that is a consistent pattern across every state in the country. And even South Australia, that doesn't have as many high affluence LGAs, still has the same shape of consumer behaviour. We then move across to what are the segments that are trending, and we go to a 3-point scale on this to make it a little bit more obvious where you've got transition across the different states. So you can see that in basically every state in the country, Cabernet has a definite under-indexation, and equally Sauvignon Blanc is starting to have a big change in what its growth potential is. And conversely, things like Prosecco, Rosé, PG, and Spritz and Pinot Noir are the products that are starting to have much more growth in what consumers are purchasing. South Australia is our undisputed home of wine production for every state in the country. But there is some growth coming out of particularly Victoria, and that's been the state that's shown the most growth of sales of any state in the country. Probably not surprising. There's a lot of Prosecco, Pinot Gris, even sweeter styles grown out of the Victorian state that's led to that phenomenon over the last little while. And then if we move into parochialness, now whether it's footy teams or flavoured milk or wine, there is definitely some state biases that do play out across the states in Australia, with over 60% of our wine sales in South Australia coming from wine that is produced in South Australia. Victoria, Tasmania and WA over-index the national share of wine in their home state. And even the smaller states like New South Wales and Queensland, which has a more divergent spread of wine, have some over-indexation of their home state, but not enough to offset the diversity that exists, and particularly the over-indexation they have for international and New Zealand wines. And this, I think, is the most important thing for lots of producers to focus on, and it's the opportunity that does exist for Australian wine in New South Wales and in Queensland, which are the two biggest wine markets in the country. You can certainly see from the chart that Queensland and New South Wales show a really strong preference for international wines across many varietals, including Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand, Prosecco from Italy, Rosé, Pinot Noir and Champagne from France. The Australian equivalents, for whatever reason, are not meeting the needs of these consumers. So there's a really big opportunity with the right strategic focus to grow the market share of Australian wine in these two states. In contrast, the other states are over-indexing in supporting Australian wine. As we've talked about earlier, South Australia and Western Australia, definite preference for their home states, and in particular rosé. Tasmania over-indexes in Pinot from its home state, and then both South Australia and Tasmania over-index in South Australia made in their home state. So I'm now going to do a really, really fast, in the interest of time, wrap around the country, just to call out some of the main points of difference that exist. So Queensland, significant market for all wine producers, has an under-index, as I alluded to, in Australian wine. Climate has a really big influence on the Queensland market. White wine is the largest subcategory all year round. Queensland also has a higher proportion of sales coming from value-oriented customers. There's a big opportunity in Queensland for Australian wine, particularly white wine. And as Sauvignon Blanc starts to move through the maturity curve, it does open a path of opportunity for particularly Pinot Gris. The other thing that is an over-indexation in Queensland is spritz and sweet wines. So good opportunity for recruiting our Mil Z customer base. When we move to New South Wales, the big call out is definitely Chardonnay. It consumes significantly more Chardonnay than any other state. It also has the highest share of champagne, so an opportunity for premium sparkling. Pinot Noir has the most upside potential in New South Wales. Big undertrade compared to what exists in Victoria. And that's also important because Pinot Noir, from a red perspective, is the biggest driver of recruitment into wine that is not white or sparkling. So Victoria is arguably our most cutting-edge state for not only consumers but also producers. It has the equal highest dollar spend for the wine category, the highest engagement of Mil Z customers, the largest proportion of Pinot Noir, and the lowest share of Sauvignon Blanc. It definitely had a first mover advantage on the spritz trend, which is resulting in the highest share of sales for this segment. And the local industry is currently best placed to take advantage of all the consumer varietals that are in growth. So for the Victorian state, obviously anchoring into Prosecco and Pinot Grigio will be really important into the future, but does present an opportunity for other states to increase their production of those specific varietals that consumers are gravitating to. Western Australians love Western Australian wine. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. The local wineries and regions resonate really deeply with the WA customers, to the point where they spend 4 times more on Western Australian wines than the national average. The varietal preferences are very much shaped by the coastal climate and the pioneers of the local industry. So lots of Cabernet, lots of Chardonnay. WASB and SSB will outsell Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc every week of the year in WA. And it has the highest share of Prosecco nationally. And then we move to South Australia, which is our undisputed powerhouse of the Australian wine industry, and that consumers in South Australia have an overwhelming preference for Australian wines, and within that, South Australian wines. The watch out here is the over-indexation in the things that are more challenged from a growth perspective. So there needs to be some consideration to how do you adapt what's currently being consumed, produced in the state, to be more in line with where customers are transitioning to across sort of more lighter styles of wine. And there's some great stuff that can be done in sort of diversifying into more PG, Grenache, Riesling, etc. And then finally, in Tasmania, another really strong state for locally produced wine, has the highest over-indexation in wine of its own, from its own state. Sparkling NV ranks as Tasmania's second highest wine segment. Like Queensland, Sauvignon Blanc is a dominant wine varietal. It under-indexes in wine consumption by younger and middle-aged generations, and it has a low wine sales mix versus the rest of the country. So plenty of opportunities to certainly anchor our premium sparkling wine for the whole country, and not only Tasmania, that can come from that particular state. So as you can see, that was a really quick flyover of a very detailed document that has lots of information that is available to the industry to help guide and shape choices that are made. And I will be hanging around if there's any questions a bit later. Thank you. And I will stop sharing.
Yeah, and I'm coming back. Thank you so much, Lee. That was so much data so quickly. I'm pretty sure that in question time, we're going to be asking you to pull up a few of those slides again. So don't close down that presentation, because sometimes you just needed to have a bit more of a longer look at 1 or 2 of those slides to really digest them. So what I ask everyone to do, you've probably all got questions right in your mind right now for Lee. I ask them to drop you into your Q&A right now. Drop them there now. I don't think we haven't had any questions yet. So just start thinking about the slides that you felt like you wanted to see more of, so that we know where to point Lee back when we bring her back. But for now, we're just going to move on to giving Sam a bit of a chat. So I invited Sam Scarrett to come along to briefly talk about vineyard plantings, because wine has such a long lead time, and new vines might take years before they're productive. So we sort of thought it was quite important to actually just, whenever we're thinking about what's happening at the consumer end of the market, to reach back to the vineyard and just reflect on what's happening in the vineyard. Like all things, success relies on excellent communication. So all the marketers that are watching here, make sure you tell your growers through your network what you're planning if you've got big plans for particular things. So let me introduce Sam. So Sam's the CEO of Vine Health Australia and also sits on the board as Vice President of the ASVO, which is a membership body for the technical excellence in the wine industry, and is also on the board of the Wine Tech Conference, AWITC. Her career spans 25 years in the vineyard and grower management, including Director of Grape Supplier Accolade, consulting roles, and 18 years in the New Zealand wine industry. Vine Health Australia, despite its name, is actually focused on South Australia, and in particular on reducing the risk of phylloxera in South Australia. So South Australia is somewhat unique in having Vine Health Australia Vineyard Register, which captures the details of the vineyards in South Australia that are over 0.5 hectares, and that includes new plantings. So while we might not have data for every state that we can present today, we basically just have the data that we have available, which happens to be South Australia, and that's what I've asked Sam to look at for us today. So Sam, over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Ruth. I'll just bring up my presentation. All right, so hopefully you can all see that now. Thanks so much, Ruth, for having me, and also Wine Communicators of Australia for asking me to speak today. I'm basically going to be presenting, as Ruth said, I'm going to go really grassroots on you now. After hearing Lee's great presentation at the sales level, we're going to get down and really talk about data that comes from the Vine Health Australia Vineyard Register, and that really is around vineyard planting data. So it will get a little bit heavy in terms of data, but I appreciate any questions, of course, towards the end if you have any. Just before I get into the numbers, I thought I'd start with really giving you just a tiny little bit of context about who Vine Health Australia is. Ruth gave a little introduction at the beginning, but I wanted to let you know that we're an independent statutory authority established 125 years ago, where the Vine Health Australia is the Phylloxera and Grape Industry Board of South Australia trading as Vine Health Australia, and Vine Health Australia is governed by a board. We've got a really small team of 5 people, but 4.1 FTEs. And our core functions really are, or our powers and functions really are derived from the Phylloxera and Grape Industry Act of 1995. And those core functions really are around biosecurity. Right, so biosecurity training and awareness, biosecurity policy and procedures, research and development around really more phylloxera, but also biosecurity, and then priority setting in terms of biosecurity. So that's around particularly phylloxera, but preparedness, prevention, and response activities. Now, the board of Vine Health Australia report to the Minister for Primary Industries and Regional Development and Minister for Forest Industries, who is the Honourable Claire Scriven. Vine Health Australia is funded by a mandatory levy, and as Ruth alluded to, that is paid by all vineyard owners in South Australia over 0.5 of a hectare. So, given what I've just told you about Vine Health Australia, any data that I share with you today is South Australian data only. And whilst this data represents half of the Australian wine grape vineyards by area, as shared in the State of the Grapes report, every state's slightly different in terms of preference towards wine, and certainly each state is different in terms of grape varieties and styles being grown in them. So whilst Lee mentioned Prosecco and Glera, obviously Glera is not a variety that's really widely grown in South Australia yet, so you probably won't see that featured in the slides. All right, and now some really high-level context about the Vine Health Australia Vineyard Register. It holds data and vineyard maps, so geospatially located maps for every vineyard in South Australia over 0.5 of a hectare. And this also includes table grapes, but wine grapes makes up 99.5% of the area. And so, as I mentioned before, this register holds information for approximately half of Australia's wine grapes by vineyard area. Its primary reason, as I mentioned before, about Vine Health's primary reason is about biosecurity, but it's also has information in it that can be used for things about talking about supply, and obviously vineyard area. It's a really important asset for Vine Health Australia, but also South Australia. And Vine Health Australia provide this data to Wine Australia for the South Australian Wine Grape Crush Survey, and the 2025 South Australian Wine Grape Crush Survey has just been released and is available on our website. All right, so this is the first graph I'm going to show you today. I'm then going to show you 9 slides, which are tables with a lot of numbers on them. So I hope it's not too heavy for you, but I'll talk you through and walk you through it as best I can. And of course, if you've got any questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll see what we can do about answering them at question time. So Vine Health Australia has been storing data on vineyard plantings in South Australia in the register for 125 years. But in 1991, these records were digitised. And so this graph shows you the total planted vineyard area in South Australia since 1991. And what you can see here is that approximately now there is approximately 75,000 hectares of vineyards currently planted in South Australia. And at its peak in 2008, the planted area was just under 80,000 hectares. Now, there's been a lot of conversation and discussion around oversupply in Australian wine at the moment, and there have been comments about structural change required of approximately 20 to 30% a reduction in planted area to bring supply and demand into more balance. If this occurred, that would take the South Australian, assuming it was half of the entire industry, that would take the South Australian vineyard area to approximately 53 to 60,000 hectares, which is about a 15 to 22,000 hectare reduction in vineyard area. But it is worthwhile noting that, as you can see from this graph, that Vine Health Australia aren't really seeing that in our data yet. It's also worth noting that Vine Health Australia, I should say vineyard owners are required to notify us of change of anything to do with their area or varietal change within 3 months of that change. So we're just not seeing that yet. Also, from what we can tell, the more or less static state that you can see in this graph of planted area means that the more desirable varieties are being planted, but less desirable varieties are being removed. All right, now I'm going to start off with my tables of data. This is the first one of 9. And so this slide shows the change in the top 10 varieties by planted area in South Australia in the past 10 and 5 years. So change, you'll see here, is also in hectares, and it is the amount planted and removed. So it is effectively the change in area. So I guess what I'm saying here is that some varieties may be increasing and decreasing at the same time. So you can see 10-year and 5-year change here. And while we see Shiraz remains the variety planted to the largest area, followed by Cabernet and Chardonnay, Shiraz has seen an increase of 5% in South Australia in the last 10 years, so 1,331 hectares changed, or increased, I should say, but in the last 5 years there's actually been a slight decrease in Shiraz. Pinot Noir and Grenache and Pinot Gris have sustained increased area of planting in the last 10 and 5 years, and that sort of really speaks to some of the information that we're seeing in the State of the Grapes report that Lee mentioned before. And also, I guess worth pointing out here that Sauvignon Blanc has seen a decrease in the last 10 years, a slight decrease, but in the last 5 years it has seen an increase. Okay, so my next slide, and I should also mention that as I move on, these next tables are all around varieties that are planted to 50 hectares or more in size. And so that'll be the same for the next 8 slides. But basically this slide shows varieties that have increased in planted area the most over the last 10 years. And so I guess apart from the green box, which you're probably all looking at because it's been highlighted, the thing that really strikes me the most out of this slide is that actually the increase in planting area isn't that great in the last 10 years. And so pretty quickly, as we look down this table, we're getting to less than 100 hectares of plantings, or change, I should say. And you can see here Pinot Gris and Pinot Noir are ranked second and third in terms of an increase in planted area. So that also fits in with the State of the Grapes report that Lee presented. Interestingly here, for me, Fiano, I don't think it was mentioned in the State of the Grapes report, but that's changed significantly in the last 10 years in terms of its planted area, and it might be because it's starting from a lower base. So, but we are seeing obviously significant increase in South Australia in Fiano plantings. All right, so this is more of an interest slide, but I put it in anyway. This slide shows varieties increase by percentage change the most. And whilst some of these varieties aren't really planted in large areas, it's just, I thought it might be quite interesting for people to see, because what it's showing is the supply side and the change side that's actually happening even at the smaller scale. Because if I didn't show this slide, you'd only be looking at really big plantings, and you also can't tell if it's warm or cool climate. So, you know, again, Fiano at the top there in terms of percentage change, just coming from a low base, obviously Nero, very low base, but the percentage change is significant. And I guess the point here for me is that these may be future trends that we're seeing here. So, some interesting things there. Of course, Pinot Gris, Pinot Noir and Grenache, as called out in the State of the Grapes report, are on this table as well in terms of percentage change. Okay, so I've included the increase. So now I wanted to show you the decreased varieties that have decreased the most by area. And this is across South Australia, of course. So obviously you can see Chardonnay has decreased the most by area and change, Merlot, Semillon, Riesling, etc. So I just thought I'd put that data up there for you, and you can take from that what you will in terms of what that means. But I guess an interesting one for me on that is actually around the Cabernet. Not a huge significant change in the last 10 years, but coming from quite a big base. All right, so now I'll move on to varieties that have decreased the most as a percentage change. And so here, you know, whilst these varieties, not all of them have large areas, they've shown significant change. And again, this is a bit of an interest piece and an interest slide, but it might be showing you some trends that are happening that we're not seeing through the sales side. Obviously, you can see large percentage changes there in, well, Sultana, but Verdelho and Semillon, significant change there. And again, this is for all across South Australia, and this includes varieties that are planted to 50 hectares or more. So then I thought we'd pull apart cool climate varieties and regions. So this slide shows varieties that are planted in cool climate regions. So for us, our interpretation of that was all regions in South Australia except for the Riverland. Obviously, as I mentioned before, varieties that are planted 50 hectares or more in size, which have increased in planted area the most in the last 10 years. So, you know, interestingly, Shiraz is the top there, and it showed a 6.2% increase in change, or a 1,303 hectares change in the last 10 years. But just worth mentioning that in the last 5, it has declined very, very slightly by 0.2% in those cool climate regions. Also, here you've obviously got those varieties that were called out in the State of the Grapes report, the Pinot Noir and the Pinot Gris, showing that they're increasing. But you've also got some of those other varieties that are called out before, like Fiano, that's really changed. Grenache, we're seeing some change in, and significant area, even though it's 200 hectares, it's still changing quite a bit. Malbec, etc. And Nero. So some of those varieties that, even though they're coming from a small base, might be of interest in terms of what we'll see in the future. And then if I go again to cool climate varieties that have increased the most by percentage change, this is again just some of those don't always come from a big base, but you've got the Grenache, Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris really showing change there. Again, Fiano, Nero and some of those other varieties showing significant change. So
Not to just to interrupt you just briefly, there's been
yeah.
a question here about why Barossa and McLaren Vale are called cool climate. So I guess there's,
Good
a bit
question.
of an understanding. Yeah, you could just go through what your understanding is that why you've classified them that way.
It's a good question. Thank you, Barossa and McLaren Vale, for highlighting that, or whoever highlighted that. Sorry, I was about to thank at the end, Warren Birchmore, my technical manager at Vine Health Australia, pulled this data together. And I guess it's a good question. It's probably historically some of the larger corporate that we've worked for has defined it that way. So look, if there's anything in here that you'd like more information on, I'll mention it at the end. Happy to pull some of this stuff apart and have a conversation with you about it as well. So if it helps. We've also presented to regional associations last year, where we actually pulled apart by region some of the change and top 10 varieties and things like that, and produced a one-pager for each region on that. So more than happy to share even last year's or update it for you if you would like for this year. So just reach out if there's anything you would like to see. So thanks, Ruth, for that question. So just down to my last two slides. So we've actually got here the cool climate varieties that have decreased by area the most. And you can see Chardonnay at the top there in terms of area, and then Merlot, Semillon, Riesling have actually decreased the most. Yeah, so that's the numbers there. And then if I go to the final slide, which is really around cool climate varieties that have decreased the most by percentage in the last 10 years, and are actually working from the bottom up there, so Semillon. So some of these may not come from the largest bases, but it's just showing you the percentage of change. I guess the only other thing here is we've shown the 10-year trends and the 10-year changes. When I looked at the data over the last 5 years and tried to look for trends, actually the 5-year data outside of the top 10 varieties that was listed in table 1 is following similarly to the 10-year trend. And if anything, probably the biggest thing I noticed was that actually planting has reduced, right? So it's slowed. But you're still seeing Pinot Noir, Pinot Gris, and particularly Grenache that are being planted more. So that's it from me. Basically, any questions, any information that you need, you can contact us at our office. All my contact details are there. I'd again personally like to thank Warren Birchmore, our technical manager, for pulling the data for these slides together. And if you've got any questions, I'll hand over to Ruth, who can help moderate question time. Thank you.
Thank you. So there's only a couple of questions in there so far, but I just want to, I guess, draw some key conclusions from Sam's presentation. Is that there is a bit of a disconnect between the fact that Shiraz and Cabernet haven't slowed really, probably, or haven't declined, and there hasn't been a lot of pulling of those varieties, with respect to Lee's data, which shows that they are not the growing varieties, but where there has been a connection has been with Pinot Gris, Pinot Noir, and Grenache, I think, which we're seeing in both plantings. And so I guess it is good to see that there is some connections between the messages from the market getting back to growers, or opportunities that growers are creating, getting to market. So either way, it works. We're very thankful we've got Angus Barnes, the previous EO for WCA, on here, and he's asked two questions. The first is, Lee, this is going to be for you. Before I go on, Alex is just going to pop up on the screen a really quick poll. It's only the one thing you have to do before you leave. So if you are planning to leave before the end of question time, this poll will come up on your screen very shortly, and I want you to just answer it, just to let us know if the webinars are hitting the spot in terms of the topics that we're choosing. So answer that, and then it'll disappear. But yeah, Angus wants to know, Lee, about what's happening with alternate reds like Sangiovese, Montepulciano and Tempranillo. did the data sort of have any insights? And can you pull perhaps one of your slides that has a little bit more detail?
Let me see if I can do that. The short answer is all of those varietals are growing. It's just the scale of them at this juncture in time is quite small. So let me see if I'll just share this. Can't actually remember if we went.
I think it was WA that was particularly into emerging reds, wasn't it?
All the states are growing.
Oh, okay.
So everyone is growing in emerging everything. It's just they're tinsy. 1 second.
To understand the consumer insights while you're looking for that, Lee, I'm just talking, just generally, it'd be great to actually understand why emerging varieties are growing. Like, is it consumers having a spirit of exploration and wanting to try new things? Is it linked to the socialization trend? All of those are great food wines, but perhaps it's more about bringing something new to a social occasion that you can talk to or something like that. I don't know.
I don't think it's that profound. I think it's more that those wines are stylistically more in the lighter, more medium-bodied styles. So anything that kind of has medium palate weight is a little bit more approachable, less tannic, is in growth.
Yeah.
This one, maybe. No, I don't think we've got anything, but I'm happy to share afterwards. I can send a couple of things around.
They're too small, are they, to actually to sort of show up on the report?
Yeah, I can't remember what the threshold that we used in terms of scale was, but those are definitely below Grenache. Temps bigger than Sange, multiple Chano, non-existent, Nero and Neb both in growth. And probably the biggest growth in Nebbiolo of all of the emerging varietals, but the smallest, obviously.
Okay, that's quite interesting. Angus has also asked about premium Aussie, like the change between premium Aussie sparkling and mainstream non-vintage sparkling.
Was there as in, are we seeing
happening between them? Like, is there a move away from mainstream non-vintage sparkling into premium Aussie other than Tasmania? And we know Tasmania over indexes in that from the data, but
now what I would say is premium, let's call it over $30, just so we've got a line in the sand on what premium is. Australian sparkling is tiny. It is in growth. There's been a bit of leakage out of champagne because as champagne's gone up in price, customers are looking for some more value. In terms of what I'd call mainstream Australian sparkling, so maybe that like $20 to $25 space, it's very stable. So it's not leaking from, let's call it $20 mainstream Australian fizz into Spritz and Prosecco, different customer. Those customers have picked up what would have been the sub $15 Australian sparkling, which is where there's more decline.
Right. Okay. So Marcus has made an observation and a general question about looking at both presentations and seeing that decrease in Shiraz plantings and the change in consumer preferences towards those lighter grape varieties. He's saying, what does this mean for Shiraz producers? Should the Shiraz vineyards being pulled out, and should Shiraz producers just be focusing on export? That's the $1 million question, Marcus. I don't know that we can answer that today.
No, that's a crystal ball, silver bullet question. What I would say is, yes, we talk a lot about traditional varietals being in decline. The reality is, though, they are still the biggest single varietals that we sell to our customers every single week. So I don't think it's a let's lose hope in Shiraz, which is, largely what the Australian wine industry internationally has been built on and is a favourite of domestic consumers. What we need to be, in my opinion, sort of working towards is making sure that there's a Shiraz for all occasions, right? Like, you can make it so it's less tannic, a little bit less robust, there's definitely different parts of Australia that stylistically Shiraz shows up differently. So in my mind, it's probably more around a reinvention and being able to delineate, particularly on the packaging sometimes, where sort of the spectrum of Shiraz is, because I think if it becomes a bit one size fits all, which is in my mind how it's kind of promoted holistically across the industry, consumers can't see that it's got more strings in its bow than the one that they're familiar with. And it does. And we make awesome Shiraz in Australia. So we've got to make sure that we're putting its best foot forward.
Absolutely, yeah, and start teasing out those differences and making it a more nuanced variety. It might be like with Riesling when they added the Riesling scale of perhaps of sweetness. Instead, it might be how heavy bodied is, full bodied is the Shiraz for people that are looking if it's made in a lighter style.
I think the other really good example of that is what's happened with buttery Chardonnay, which is kind of like the inverse, where in the last kind of 12 to 24 months, we've had a whole lot of producers start to lean into a sort of bigger style of Chardonnay, and we've definitely had both older and younger customers gravitate and seek that out, and it's driving quite a lot of growth in the Chardonnay segment.
Interesting, isn't it? Because if we're moving to lighter styles, you would have thought that the leaner Chardonnays would be growing, and what you're saying is those richer, more buttery Chardonnays are growing.
Both are growing,
right?
But there's bigger growth off a smaller base in buttery.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I didn't feel from the data that I saw that Chardonnay was a bit of any of shining light, which was incredibly disappointing to me because I absolutely love Chardonnay. And somebody else on here has also sort of noted that Chardonnay is a bit of a surprise from both presentations. They probably were expecting it to be looking a little bit more healthy in terms of sales growth. The question is, are Chardonnay sales declines below $20 or, so it's more that low end Chardonnay that's declining?
Yeah, if you think about just that occasion leakage, and this is a bit of a broad sweeping generalization, so forgive me for it, midweek wine is going to be largely, let's call it below $25, and that is where the biggest volume leak in red, white and sparkling is, and we're seeing stabilize to growth in every price point above that volumetrically. So that kind of clouds the data in terms of where there's leakage out of the category versus where consumers are engaging with it in terms of it's meeting their needs. And you've got to be really careful when you kind of look at it in aggregate.
Question, I think, here for Sam, that Wei Dong has noticed that Semillon plantings in South Australia have dropped quite a bit in recent years. Do you think that's influenced anyway by the strong presence of Hunter Semillon, or is it a more overall market demand for Semillon declining? So it's sort of like a double, either of you could answer, but maybe Sam, you maybe first answer on the plantings.
Yes, looking at Semillon plantings across South Australia, they've decreased significantly, like 42%, so down about 500 hectares in change, and that's not off a huge base. So the why, I'm not sure. I can only really comment on the data that we have, which is around change. So, yep.
No worries. I can see Jane's asked a question about, is there any data around yields for different varieties? I'm pretty sure the answer to that would be really that you'd need to look at the crush data that Wine Australia produces.
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking the same thing. So if you teed up some of the information that we have and is produced through SA Wine Crate Crush survey data that we feed Wine Australia, and then you applied a yield to it, an average yield, you should be able to work out volumes.
Okay. So, Lee, on Semillon, I remember noticing that apparently the West Australians still love their Semillon blends. But was that in New South Wales? Was Semillon still holding over-indexing it all in New South Wales?
Yeah, it still over-indexes in New South Wales.
Yeah. So those states that produce it and that are famous for it basically still have traction there. So Bryn has asked a question about to Lee. Are you seeing any change of share in merchandising floor space and in fridges for wine compared to, say, the increasing footprint of RTDs?
At an aggregate level, no. What you would see, though, is as we assess stores on an individual basis, there may be fridge reallocation in stores where there's an over-index in RTDs. So if you go to make it up, Double Bay in New South Wales, there will be more fridge space for wine where it is appropriate. If you go to a store that over-indexes in RTDs, and there's lots of them in sort of far north Queensland, they will have a disproportionate amount of fridges that meet their customer needs for other categories.
Right. Okay, well, we'll be wrapping up very, very shortly. So hopefully, if there's any last questions, you better rush and get them into the Q&A. But it is almost time to wrap up. But I guess if somebody wants to see the full data report, Lee, where's the best place for them to get it?
It is on the Wine Australia website, and it is also on the Endeavour website.
So that's where you'll get the full report, because it's not possible to share the presentation that Lee gave electronically. You can watch the webinar again when you get the link, but it's best to go to the actual full report, and then you'll actually probably find a lot more data that you find very interesting. I think for us as communicators, we've now got to consider how we take this information, which is really a snapshot. Like, this is a snapshot of what's happening now and the trends in the last few years. That's happening now. We have to reflect on that and work out what we're going to do with that, how we're going to change our product portfolios, how we might amend our winemaking styles, back to how we communicate back to our growing teams about which varieties we want to pursue in the future. So it's really great to have data and information that we can work from, which has been the point of looking at this. And hopefully everyone's found it very, very useful. So hopefully you've all answered the 5-point scale too about whether or not this webinar was relevant. Our next webinar is on Tuesday, the 9th of September, and it is on the topic of the tyranny of distance, communicating with your export partners, and we'll be giving 5 simple steps to improving communications with your export distributions partners. But just as a reminder, for members, all the recordings, all the past recordings, you've got access to those on the WCA website for free, and Alex will send out a link to this webinar so that you can watch it again. I want to thank again our presenters, Lee Firkin from Endeavour and Sam Scarrett from Brian Health, for bringing us all this wonderful information, all this wonderful data that is going to, I'm sure, pour into our marketing strategies over the coming years. Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks for dialing in, and we'll see you next time.